China is very much the dominant power, the lead power. It has dominance over Russia these days because Russia depends on China to buy its commodities in order to get foreign currency. China has been the lead supporter of the current beleaguered regime in Iran. China has always been the big brother to the little brother of North Korea. This complicates America's position everywhere. It forces America to continue to keep forces in Europe. It complicates America because it needs to have a couple of carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean dealing with Middle East instability and Iran. And so the US has not been able to build up its forces as fast as it would like in the Pacific region, which is really the key center of global strategic competition.
Peter Jennings, welcome back to the IPA offices.
Scott, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for everything that you do in the field of defence and national security, and there's never a shortage of things for us to talk about. I believe, Peter, the last time we were having a discussion like this, we were reflecting on a very low moment in Australia's national security history, which was the somewhat pathetic response to the Chinese Navy's visit, their circumnavigation of Australia during the election campaign. And we now have reports that there is another flotilla en route through the Philippines at the moment. Are we going to see a repeat of that last exercise?
I think we are. And it's very interesting that particular flotilla event, February 2025, it was an example of a group of People's Liberation Army, or PLA, warships came down to the Tasman Sea of all places, and they were doing live gunfire activities, I believe testing a few missiles, and we didn't know about it until such time as a pilot, actually a commercial pilot, flew over and said that they'd just been warned by the Chinese Navy that this was happening. And our government got very defensive about that. They were saying that, well, what in fact the PLA was doing was perfectly legal. But this was a provocative measure, something that was done to, I think, show the relative powerlessness of the Australian Navy in response. And we had the pretty unedifying spectacle of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister all really defending the Chinese position. Okay, so fast forward to now, December 2025, and all of a sudden our media is reporting that there is a Chinese flotilla in the Philippine Sea, that's way north of Australia, but speculating that it's going to come down to do another circumnavigation, possibly another gunfire drill. And defensively, Richard Miles, just a couple of days ago, said, well, we're watching it. We're not sure where it's going, but if it comes towards Australia, we'll continue to monitor it closely. What I will be looking for, Scott, is any indication of, is the Navy being given permission to be more aggressive in its management of this? More overflights of the Chinese ship, more attempts to disrupt their electronic warfare activities, which will be happening on board those ships. There are definitely things we could do which would keep the Chinese Navy on their toes and kind of make the point, well, you can't just come down here to our part of the world to do whatever.
Because this is a testing exercise. I mean, the whole point of this is to continually probe and test not just a military response, but essentially the political stance that the government is going to take. And we failed that test in February.
Badly, yes.
So there is a real risk that this could be a second strike. And this is a learning curve that a lot of countries in the that border the South China Sea have already learnt. That my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that now the Philippines, certainly the Japanese, with fishing vessels and other, quasi-military vessels, there's a much more robust response taking place now. Exactly the kind of shadowing that you're talking about. No one wants conflict, but you can't sit there and just cop it either.
Absolutely right. And I think, the Philippines, which, to be frank, has a much less capable Navy than the Royal Australian Navy, is up there in the fight pretty much every day with the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy defending Philippines' sovereign territory. The Japanese do the same with their self-defense force. What China, I think, is trying to get from Australia. And in fact, what they're getting from Australia is a type of subservience. They want our government to be making excuses for them. They want us to be low profile. And I just don't think it works to Australia's interest for that to happen. So, why doesn't Prime Minister Albanese ring up Xi Jinping and say, hey, this is not acceptable, please don't do it to us? Why doesn't Foreign Minister Penny Wong use her relationship with Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Minister, to do the same thing? Too often our government is going out of the way to see things from the perspective of a more aggressive China. That does not work to Australia's interests, but it means to say right now the government is exactly where Xi Jinping wants us to be, which is quiet and subservient, and I don't think that's good for Australia.
No, and the other context for this at the moment is we've had a change of Prime Minister in Tokyo and a revitalised Prime Ministership reminiscent of Shinzo Abe in terms of a willingness to actually tell the truth about China's ambitions, a willingness to tell the truth about what a CCP invasion of Taiwan would mean for Japanese security, and to say that prospectively. And of course now the PRC is ramping up a propaganda campaign against the Japanese government, against the Japanese people. We're back to relitigating Manchuria in 1936, and certainly the Japanese record there was not good, but we're in a very different political environment now, and it's a sign of their desperation to malign the Japanese. And meanwhile, Australia, as Shingo Yamagami, the former ambassador to Australia, has pointed out, has been silent, offering no support at all to the government of Japan.
Yes, I think that's really deeply regrettable. And of course, what Shingo Yamagami is pointing to is that we've had a steadily closer defence relationship being built between Japan and Australia over quite some period of time. I will even give the Albanese government some credit for continuing that process over the last 4 years. But we have an Australian government which consistently doesn't want to pay the costs of close strategic relationships. It'll sign documents and claim to have new relationships with Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and all of these things. But when push comes to shove, if you're not prepared to actually defend friendly, like-minded governments against the appalling wolf warrior rhetoric that was directed against the Japanese Prime Minister, saying that they would cut her neck for sticking it out on the defence of Taiwan, an Australian Prime Minister should have wrung his Japanese counterpart. And our Foreign Affairs establishment should do what they'd never do, which is call in the Chinese ambassador and say, this language is unacceptable. It's actually doing China damage. And we need to be firmer friends of those countries we're partnering with, and that includes Japan.
Indeed. Yes, so the follow-through isn't there. And indeed, I'm sure you knew at some point, Peter, that we'd be inviting viewers to reflect back on this wonderful publication, No Higher Priority, which was launched by General Sir Peter Cosgrove earlier this year, and which was authored by you and your colleagues, published by the IPA with an introduction by me. It's definitely the highlight of the book. But one of the recommendations in there, of course, was for to bring Japan into indeed a much closer relationship, and even I think we looked at ANZUS as a potential vehicle by which we could much more formally get Japan involved. But yes, if we're not going to follow through on any of these commitments, it's sort of...
Well, and if we go to water every time China gets a bit aggressive, which is where we're at right now. And thank you for pointing out the book. I still think it's pretty live and relevant to, where we are 8 or so months after its release. We suggested that it was time to either bring Japan into the ANZUS treaty, so you might call it JANZUS or something of that nature, but you could have a third active member, or alternately an Australia-Japan security treaty as strong as ANZUS, which means to say that you'd have language in there about how a threat to each other's security would be regarded as a common threat, and we take steps to help Japan protect its interests as they would take steps to protect ours. Japan is the most consequential democracy in the Indo-Pacific region, other than the United States. They are a natural partner for Australia.
They have announced an intention to dramatically increase their defence expenditure.
Yes, absolutely. They appreciate the nature of the threat, and in particular on Taiwan, unlike so many in Australia, Japan doesn't think that they can just sort of sit this fight out. The closest Japanese island to Taiwan is about 120 kilometres away. And just as we see Chinese maritime exercises now surrounding Taiwan, the Japanese fear is that the same thing could happen to them if China is able to attack and occupy Taiwan and sort of take over that critical element of the first island chain, so it can push its own navy out further into the Pacific. It's strategically vital for Japan, which is why the new Japanese Prime Minister made the comments that she did, but no less strategically vital for Australia. And so, as I've often said, we either hang together or we'll hang separately in this strategic fight that we're facing at the moment.
Yes, and what she's done is actually tell the truth. We were talking before about a book that both of us now want to have a look at, and I think it's relevant to the over you've just described. I think, and it helps to look at a map, the sort of the military domain of Taiwan and what it represents in the Asia-Pacific region. But just geopolitically, very interested in this book, Autocrats versus Democrats, which is China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder, authored by Michael McFaul, whom I believe you have met. And the point again there is the original Cold War was very much an ideological separation between the West and what then on the other side was China, Russia, the Warsaw Pact countries. And what we have now is not necessarily a strict ideological divide. Finally, people are starting to admit that communism doesn't work, but we do have these autocratic countries. And as you say, Japan is a democracy. It is our friend. There is a battle for the future of the globe underway, and on one side is certainly China and Russia, which are autocratic and proud to be autocratic, that are constantly maligning the democratic world publicly and using grey warfare, including misinformation and disinformation campaigns, genuine ones, not the ones that we're accused of, but actually genuine ones, to undermine the morale of the West. And again, unless we're aware of this reality, we're just going to get run over.
Yes. Well, I think it's a positive that successive American administrations have realised that this is a new threat. McFaul was active in the Biden administration, which you and I, I'm sure, could fault for a number of things, not least the president's own mental capacities towards the end of his time. But on the need to be strong and resist Chinese aggression, the Biden administration was pretty good and very much within.
It became bipartisan policy in Washington,
and remains so, which is a good thing. Now, what's interesting is that a few years ago, if we were meeting, we probably wouldn't have put that much emphasis on the idea of a partnership between China, Russia, Iran, let's add North Korea. But it really has become a thing, Scott. And it's not that these countries necessarily trust each other, but they all understand that there is actually benefit in cooperating together. And the way I think about it is, China is very much the dominant power, the lead power. It has dominance over Russia these days because Russia depends on China to buy its commodities in order to get foreign currency. China has been the lead supporter of the current beleaguered regime in Iran. China has always been the big brother to the little brother of North Korea. But I think the calculation that Xi Jinping makes is that this complicates America's position everywhere. It forces America to continue to keep forces in Europe. It complicates America because it needs to have a couple of carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean dealing with Middle East instability and Iran. And so the US has not been able to build up its forces as fast as it would like in the Pacific region, which is really the key center of global strategic competition. In other words, China is using its connection with these three countries. And it bothers the daylights out of me that we just don't seem to ever get this picture in our minds in Australia about the big strategic events which are taking place. Do you know, it's not about if we can sell lobster to China. It really isn't. Trade with China is great for as long as we'll be able to do it, but none of that changes the strategic plan, which is for China to become the dominating power in our part of the world. Is that in our interests? No, it's not. So, you know, I'll certainly be buying McFell's book. I think we should all do that. There's others writing these things, including H.R. McMaster, who was National Security Advisor for Trump in Trump's first term.
Yes.
There's a lot of good American thinking going on. And it actually points to a related fact here that I don't see the Trump administration as being isolationist at all. I think they're very much directed to projecting strong American power.
Well, it provides also a framework for understanding what's going on in its relationship with NATO, where it was seen as isolationism. Vance's Munich Security Conference speech, where he really gave it to the Europeans both barrels and said it's time you started lifting your weight and literally lifting your defence expenditure as a percentage of GDP.
Yep.
And that was seen as an American withdrawal from Europe. But in many ways, in the context we've just been discussing, it's better to understand it as the Europeans do need to lift their game in their own theatre against the autocratic alliance so that the Americans can concentrate on the Asia-Pacific region. It's not withdrawing from the world, it's not withdrawing from Europe, but why should America underwrite the security of France and Germany and Poland and Hungary and all these other countries? And there is some sign that the European countries, certainly the former Warsaw Pact countries, are responding.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that there's almost a relationship between if a country has experienced the joys of being under Soviet control, these days they know they never want to go back to that experience again. So that's why the Poles and others are lifting their spending dramatically. But so too the Western Europeans, of course the Baltic states. They're all very concerned about being the next potential target for Russia. And I think we should give President Trump some credit for just going beyond complaining about the Europeans not pulling their weight, but actually forcing them to do more. And, the lesson that we should learn from that, and which I think is becoming pretty clear, is that America helps those allies that help themselves. So America was prepared to help Israel, for example, in its fight against Iran and the proxy terror organizations, because Israel was prepared to do the bulk of the fighting themselves. The Taiwanese have learned this lesson because they have very recently announced they're going to lift their defence spending to 5% by 2030. That's a very big ramp up for the Taiwanese to do that. But exactly what you'd say they should do, frankly. No one should want to defend Taiwan more than the Taiwanese. But that will guarantee that the Americans, I think, will regard them as a stronger partner and therefore worth cooperating with. And so far, we're not getting that message.
No. So, and I'll circle back in a moment to the Prime Minister Albanese's visit to the White House. But let's just stay for a moment on this idea of defence expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Now, we... in No Higher Priority, available at all good bookshops and via the IPA website, we said from a base of approximately 2% of GDP, military expenditure should be increased to 3% of GDP. That was not an upper cap. That was by the end of this term of government.
Yes,
and
exactly.
In the latest edition, another wonderful IPA publication called Facts, as the name suggests, bite-size factual information to get your head around things. We are looking at trends in defence spending across the world, And when you look at the percentage change in national defence spending between 2015 and 2024, Australia is absolutely a laggard. If you compare our GDP per expenditure on defence as a percentage of GDP overall sitting at around 2%, you'd probably say that's less than the median. A country like Norway, France, Taiwan, Romania, Finland, even the UK, even Denmark spends more as a percentage of its GDP on defence. Are we getting any closer towards that 3% benchmark at the moment?
No, I regret to say we're not. And I didn't want to see our Prime Minister embarrassed in the Oval Office in the way that some world leaders have by being ticked off by President Trump. I was pleased that didn't happen because I don't think that would have been a good thing for the alliance. But it was also a little disappointing that the Americans didn't stick to a harder message to Australia, which is that we need to lift our effort. And I can't quite answer the question. Why did that happen?
I was surprised. I was quite surprised.
Why did that happen? Well, there's maybe some partial explanations. As you know, we've now signed an agreement with the Americans on critical minerals, which 10 years down the track I think will be a good thing in terms of reducing the control which the Chinese have over a large number of these so-called rare earths. Turns out they're not that rare, but a number of them are central for military technology. And so that's a positive. I think we also know that President Trump likes winners. And I can't fault Anthony Albanese for winning a pretty decisive election outcome at the last federal election. So I think he got a little bit of an easy ride when he met President Trump. The third element, Scott, is that I think, I can't necessarily prove this, but I think that our government has said to the Americans, just give us a little time, and when we go through another defence review, which we're planning to do already, can you believe this, in 2026, there'll be another defence review.
Oh, wonderful.
Then we will see some lifting in defence spending. But we are still just a shade over, possibly even just a shade under 2% of gross domestic product. That is, Richard Marles, every single press conference he holds says that this is spending more in dollar terms than any previous Australian government has spent before. That's true, but
when inflation's absolutely out of control, that's not a difficult thing to achieve.
It's only true in dollar terms. I can tell you every area of Commonwealth spending is about the most the Commonwealth has ever spent in dollar terms. But in terms of historical proportions of gross domestic product, actually we're well below our spend during the height of the Cold War, for example.
So the Hawke government is a benchmark. Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, we were much more like 3.5% in the early days of the Hawke government, now we're lagging at 2%. There is a plan. The government's current plan would take us to about 2.3% by the end of the decade. That's the same time frame where Taiwan will lift to 5%. So we are underperforming for our own security interests. It means to say we're underperforming as an ally of the United States, of Japan, of the UK. We simply have to do better.
We have to. It's absolutely unacceptable, and we are revisiting that in a coda tonight. No higher priority, that we're revisiting this whole area of defence expenditure and also the related expenditure. Like there is an accounting question around sometimes some of the countries getting to say 5%. It includes things that we wouldn't necessarily include, like expenditure on cyber warfare, offensive and defensive. But
yes,
we'll unpack some of that.
My take on that is that it doesn't add much of a material change, frankly, even if you add in some of those intelligence community spends, which tend to be very small. But yes, that's the breaking news for this podcast, Scott, is that there's going to be a new edition of No Higher Priority, a new chapter, which myself and Marcus Hellier are currently in the process of authoring. Marcus somewhat more efficiently than me, I have to say, but we're getting there, and we'll have some new recommendations. Readers may recall we made 36 recommendations for things that a new government should do in this 3-year term. I'm slightly sad to have to say not so many of those have been picked up by the current government. But one recommendation will be, okay, we now need to regard that 3% defence spend as really the floor.
The floor, yes.
Probably 4.
As I say, we had nominated that by the end of the current term.
Yes, exactly.
Because a $25 billion, 1% delta in one term of government was probably about as much as our enfeebled defence bureaucracy could have handled.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're struggling to spend it even now, frankly. So the question is, we've got to ramp up our capacity to invest more effectively. I'll just touch quickly on one other recommendation because it's relevant to our earlier discussion today, and that is, we say, look, the government needs to have a more honest conversation with the Australian people about China. We have this pretense of we've stabilised the trade relationship. But I don't think anyone really believes that is in one iota altering the broader strategic plan of China to become the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific, push the United States out, and force countries like Australia and Japan into a subservient position. Now, at some stage, our government has to summon up the courage to talk to the Australian population in a more honest way about that. And they've failed to do so. Something that I think is very interesting is that they have clearly allowed a couple of our intelligence heads, including Andrew Shearer, who's now just leaving the Office of National Intelligence. He's going to become our ambassador in Tokyo. They've allowed Andrew Shearer to give a number of public speeches, which is much more on the downside, the risk side of dealing with China. That's not happening accidentally. But I don't think it's good enough. It's not.
It's no substitute for political leadership.
We need the Prime Minister to pay some attention to this. We need the Foreign Minister, I think, to acknowledge publicly what she knows, which is that we are facing a really dire strategic outlook in terms of Australia's position in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific Islands region. So more than anything, you need democracies to have honest conversations with their electors, and our government is just failing on the China front to do that.
I couldn't agree more. Or you might even say virtually our entire political class. The opposition didn't exactly cover itself in glory in the run up to the last election either. It did make a commitment to in the death throes of the somewhat underwhelming election campaign. They did announce some slight increase in their commitment to increasing defence spending. Subsequently, James Patterson, I believe, was quoted as saying that 3% is now the opposition's accepted benchmark, but I don't believe this has been codified. It's certainly not part of a sustained discussion emerging out of the coalition. So I don't disagree with anything you say about the government, but some leadership from the other side of the chamber would be just as welcome.
They need to do a much better job. My sense of that election campaign in particular was that the opposition couldn't quite make up its mind if national security was a strength or a weakness for them. They seem to be a bit spooked and scared, and I think they've just got to get their mind around it. They've made the commitment on the spending front. What they now have to do is explain why. Why is it necessary to lift spending? Well, there's a reason, and the reason is China. So, this is not to say that we must damage the trade relationship or anything of that nature, but we've just got to be strategic realists.
Peace through security.
And I mean, I've often made the case that this is not about preparing to go to war. It's actually about preparing to deter.
Yes.
To make China think again and to conclude that conflict is not the answer. And for that, you have to invest in strong military forces, and for a country our size, strong alliance relationships.
And it's certainly in no way, as the wolf warrior diplomacy would have it, an insult to the Chinese people, to ethnic Chinese in Australia, to the glorious history of Chinese people across the globe. That in itself is a CCP propaganda exercise to say that any criticism of China's ambitions to be the global hegemon are in some way a racist slur against people of Chinese descent.
Completely so. And again, I think all sides of Australian politics need to think harder about how they deal with Australians of Chinese ethnic background. Actually, no group in this country feels the pressure more of bad behaviour from the Chinese Communist Party than Australians of Chinese ethnicity. And often I think those people feel that the government doesn't have their back, that we don't understand the nature of the pressure that they feel.
We have these shadow police forces operating within Australia.
Quite so. And
tremendous pressure on mainland Chinese students.
Yes.
Increasingly students from Hong Kong as well.
And, when I was running ASPI, I had a number of Australians of Chinese background that were really feeling that hot pressure on families that might have been back in mainland China, on how they were being attacked in most unfairly in social media. I mean, this was a very nasty campaign that was directed against those few brave individuals that were prepared to bring their language skills and their expertise about the Chinese Communist Party to bear. And we need to do a better job to support that group instead of ignoring them or feeling that the whole thing is just a bit awkward and we can't talk about it.
Yes, indeed. I will mention in passing to go back to the rare earths and critical minerals, that was certainly a card the Australian diplomats played very well, so credit to them. We at the IPA do find some irony in this, because at some point the ALP will discover that in order to access rare earths and critical minerals, you actually need to start new mines. This actually involves digging stuff up and getting approvals through environmental organisations, and having Australian government ministers actually support the development of new mines, which are vociferously opposed by the environmental movement and by the Greens. So this is a can being kicked down the road somewhat, given that the general hostility towards investment in the mining industry in Australia, and a new batch of environmental laws that they've just passed, which are actually going to make it harder, not easier, to start any of this stuff.
Yeah, this is not a slow process, is it? Sorry, not a quick process.
No.
It takes time to do these things. And in particular, something which I think is worth watching is that most of what we now produce in terms of rare earths goes across to China in its most basic form, pretty much as it's dug out of the ground for processing. And in order to be able to take back some sovereign control over that, also for the benefit of the United States, we need to build processing capabilities.
Oh my God, and processing plants involve chemicals and waste products and tailings dams and all sorts of terrible things that nobody in Glebe or Fitzroy wants to know about.
Exactly. So it's the price of national security, it's the price of sovereignty. But watch China get extremely difficult from here on, trying to do everything it can to stop a democracy from building those processing capabilities.
Yes, indeed. And that is not just overt diplomacy, but there are other means that they have, a little bit reminiscent of when the Russians used to fund the anti-nuclear movement in Europe. Because supposedly it was about scaring people about nuclear energy, but it was actually about the stationing of the missiles in Western Europe. And
so something to just sort of slightly segue from in relation to that, since the last time we spoke, of course, is that the government expelled the Iranian ambassador and the bulk of the Iranian embassy in Canberra over the discovery of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard actually engaging in terrorist activity in Australia, sponsoring an attack on a synagogue here in Melbourne, a Jewish-owned restaurant in Sydney, and quite possibly a number of other anti-Semitic acts which took place. And I think that's very interesting that now we have caught red-handed a government, foreign government, engaging in sabotage and espionage on Australian soil, designed to damage an Australian ethnic community.
And sow discord, which is one of the Autocrats' great
And so,
strategies as well.
you know, the summer of anti-Semitism, as it was described sort of last summer when a lot of this activity was taking place. So people need to understand that gambling does take place at the casino, you know, that we are facing high levels of espionage. We're also facing significant efforts on the part of governments, China in the lead, to engage in sabotage by planting malware and kill switches and other forms of technology that can be activated remotely in Australian critical infrastructure. So the grid, the emerging green grid, if one can call
Possibly
it that,
even electric vehicles.
electric vehicles. I mean, all of these things are now being used by China to, you know, create sort of a first front of a conflict, which is designed to turn the democracies into chaotic shambles, while China pursues its broader military objectives across the Indo-Pacific. And it's all happening in Australia right now. I'm just astounded at how so few people seem to be interested or care.
Yes.
But nevertheless, it's true. This is the world that we're in. It's why governments keep saying we face the most difficult time since, you know, the end of the Second World War in terms of our strategic outlook. But what are they doing about it, Scott?
But they neither describe what the why in clear enough terms, nor are they actually taking action.
And that's why our defence spending will lift to 2.3% of gross domestic product in a decade. It doesn't quite fit, does it? I mean,
the other part of that, just to get back to the delivery side of things, and you had of course a long career in the defence department and related organisations, and then ASPI. So it's no surprise that in no higher priority, recommendations 9, 10, 13, 14, 15 and 17 at least relate to the vexed issue of procurement.
Yes.
And which is both a scandal in terms of how it's managed, and also the lack of results in terms of, you know, critical things like mines, missiles and drones, which we don't appear to have any of. Even ammunition, which we don't have enough of, and the famous difficulties we've had, not just with submarines and ships, but there has been an announcement by the man who wants everyone to know that he is the Deputy Prime Minister and secondarily the Minister for Defence, but Richard Marles, who actually I think this week might even be the acting Prime Minister.
Indeed, as the Prime Minister's on his honeymoon.
Honeymoon. So during this honeymoon period, Richard Marles has announced a shake-up of defence procurement. Can you describe that and tell us what we should make of it?
Well, I think there's less to this than meets the eye, to be honest. I mean, I have lived through innumerable reorganisations of defence hire management, which usually means a change to the design of the wire diagram. In particular, what has happened on this occasion is that right now, Scott, there are three entities inside defence that are responsible for buying stuff. There's the shipbuilding group, which also does the AUKUS submarines. There's a group that does missiles, and there's a group called Capability and Sustainment, which does everything else. And these are the designers and the buyers and the builders of Australian military technology. Now, the government has now said, well, we are going to crunch these all together into a single group called the Armaments Agency, which will be kind of a separate department to the Defence Department, reporting to the existing ministers. A couple of things to note down in the detail of this. Firstly, it's not going to happen for 18 months.
Oh, good God.
The new agency is going to formally stand up on the 1st of July 2027. So Defence is giving itself a good long period of time
you've got to get your letterhead
to get ready.
Give them a chance.
The second thing is that Marles has said no one loses their job. All of the people that are currently doing these missiles, ships and everything else will all still be there. The numbers aren't going to change. What they will do is recruit a new person, I guess at the level of a secretary, to be the head of this entity.
So we need an extra secretary.
So there'll be an extra secretary. And again, I can just tell you from my life's experience that when you give the bureaucracy a reorganisation, the first thing they do is they hand out more senior jobs, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. You know, what we aren't seeing and what we talk about in the book is how do we get more private sector expertise into actually doing this. The sort of people, for example, that have built our oil and gas infrastructure over, decades. That
Defence adjacent industries.
know how to do these things very, very quickly. Why is defence actually refusing to talk to industry? We're now told by the acting Prime Minister that there's going to be consultations with industry about how to achieve this new armaments agency. But if I know defence as I do, what I think that will be is ultimately they will go out and be told, here's what we're doing, rather than asking for advice from industry about how to do it.
And not what could you provide, but like you just sit there and wait until we've written up the request for a tender proposal, and eventually you'll be invited to submit to that.
And the problem with that, of course, is that it means that all of the cutting edge thinking about new military technology is happening in the private sector. It's being designed quite often by small and medium-sized companies, including in Australia, doing some really clever things that our Department of Defence just doesn't even know about. And so the failure to engage with industry, I think, is a major letdown. And I guess my final observation on this is that the government is now well into its fourth year, so they're losing the ability to say everything is the fault of the previous governments. Although when Miles made this announcement about the acquisition agency, he managed to basically say everything was the fault of the Tony Abbott government now, 12 years ago, Scott. And sooner or later...
Sure, Bob Menzies had something to do with it.
Yes, that's right. Sooner or later, the accountability has to be sheeted home to the ministers. Miles has been sitting on top of this for 4 years, as has Pat Conroy, his defence industry minister. Where's the delivery?
Yeah, 4 years is a lifetime in political terms.
They claim that to be sufficiently dissatisfied that we've got to have a new organisation, and it's the biggest thing that's happened in defence structure in 50 years. So they know there's a problem, but aren't they part of that problem? I mean, they're the drivers of this.
Indeed. Well, the other thing is philosophically, and this is very IPA, but I think it is relevant. The other thrust of that we were getting at here is against centralisation. Like this government, and perhaps like many governments anywhere, is they've never seen a problem that they don't think they can solve by centralising power even further. And if anything, one of the thrusts of our recommendations was to push that purchasing power down to the people who actually who are in the business of applying lethal force, and giving them the authority and the budgets to actually engage directly. And I think we actually talked about sort of lowering the costs of failure. I mean, if you look at something like the incredible innovation that we've seen in the Ukrainian theatre, it's a constant process of innovation, and a bureaucratic process is the opposite of that. So they're going in completely the wrong direction.
Well, and there's actually an example of precisely what you say which has come into fruition just in the last few months, and that is a piece of military technology called Ghost Shark, which is a kind of imagine a Greyhound-sized bus, autonomous submarine. So no crew, using a large amount of artificial intelligence to function for reasons that have not been completely publicly explained. At the very end of the coalition term of government, Peter Dutton, as Defence Minister, said, hey, we're going to invest a couple of $100 million in developing this submarine, this autonomous submarine. And it's produced by an American, now an Australian company as well, called Anduril, which actually invested in a significant amount of the design of the submarine technology itself. It wasn't government money. They've actually come up with a technology where you can use 3D printers to print a significant part of the submarine hull. And the government has announced that, yes, we're going to start producing copies of this vessel for the Navy by January next year. So they've put $1 billion into this. It's going to produce these large submarines, which can be weapons carriers or sensor carriers, probably at a cost of about $50 or $60 million each, mostly on the basis of private sector investment, and delivered in 3 years. And for me, the stunning aspect of this is that somehow it managed to work its way through the defence system. The Navy wasn't able to kill it. The defence procurement system wasn't able to kill it. Now, I look at that and think to myself, this is a model of how we should be doing more military technology development, bringing in the private sector, using that expertise to do really cutting-edge stuff. It's where the future...
It's nice to hear a positive story for a change.
I mean,
get credit where credit's due.
That's my positive story. So I started by Dutton, continued by Miles, delivering from January. I look at this and say to myself, are we ever going to build another crewed ship or submarine in Australia again? Because I think autonomy is the way we're going to go. And so that then brings into question, multiple billions of acquisition programs currently underway. But we should be learning from that experience. This is the way to go.
I have a left field question about submarines because I don't want to go back to the AUKUS class submarines because we'll be here for the next 4 hours kicking over the traces of that. But I was in Perth last week with Tony Abbott doing the local launch of Australia, A History, wonderful publication that the IPA was happy to have assisted with. And Tony was reminded that he had wanted to buy conventional submarines off the Japanese, the Soryu class, I think it is.
Yeah.
And Tony was reminded that if that had been allowed to happen, then we would probably have them by now. And of course, Tony Abbott agreed that was the case. And he then volunteered something, which I believe he said on another IPA podcast, the one with Daniel Weil, that while we're waiting on trying to access Virginia-class submarines, the AUKUS-class submarines and their long gestation, America is decommissioning its LA-class submarines. And he's saying, well, if you wanted to get Australians into nuclear submarines, there is actually an opportunity to do that in a very straightforward way. So question without notice, Peter, is that something that's crossed your table that you've thought about?
I've spoken with Tony about it. It's complicated. So the Los Angeles class submarines actually carry the long-range nuclear weapons. They carry intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they're not in the business of hunting and killing other ships or submarines. They actually launch these ICBMs. They're part of the American strategic nuclear deterrence.
Probably not Australia's top priority at the moment. No?
Now, you don't have to carry nuclear missiles, though. You could launch maybe cruise missiles out of those silos. So they're big boats. They take a lot of crew. So I'm not saying no. I'm just saying it's complicated. And there's another factor which complicates it, which is... remember the Collins class submarines? Okay, so we still have 6 Collins, getting pretty ancient these days. Those boats now have to go through something called a life of type extension, which in the military speak is called a LOTE, life of type extension. And it's really complicated. They will literally cut the submarines in half, take out most of the engineering, put in a new combat system, new engines and so forth. Very, very expensive. Now, each Collins boat is going to cost in the order of well over $1 billion each.
Just to do that?
To do the life of type extension. And the extension is about a decade. That's what it does. It buys you an extra decade. Now, I go back to what I was saying about the Ghost Shark, the autonomous weapon that we can churn out by the dozens for about $50 or $60 million a copy. So right now, the government is spending $1.2 billion to get 24 of those Ghost Shark. That's about the cost of a single Collins boat being extended for a decade. Do the numbers add up? So what I would put on the table is to say that maybe the future, and of course the Navy's not in love with this idea at all, but maybe the future is that we have submarines with no crew. And that's where we go.
Well, there we go. So we've got one left field idea countered by a different left field idea. But we have plenty of those.
What would be great, though, is if we could have a system where defence as an organisation and the government was mature enough to have the debate. Why not talk about it? But no one would ever have those sorts of discussions.
No, and indeed the cruise missile idea is perhaps an alternative to recommendation 1, which was to look at the B-21 Raider stealth bomber to give us that long-range capability to be able to project power into the Asia Pacific. I might wrap up with a few other things, actually, a bit of a laundry list. So one thing that we have done is the government has selected the Megami frigate from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Did they get that right?
Yes, I think they did. So this was a choice that ultimately came down to a Japanese frigate, the Megami, versus a German design frigate. And I think for strategic reasons as well as for technical reasons to do with the design of the ship, the government has made the right call. The plan, however, now gets more complicated because in theory what's going to happen is the first 3 of these boats, which will replace the Anzac frigate, by the way, they will be built in Japan by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And then through a process of magic, which hasn't been quite completely explained yet, the intellectual property to build these boats is going to be shifted over to a conglomeration of different entities based at Henderson near Fremantle in Western Australia. And, from what I can see, that is turning out to be a really difficult and challenging thing to do. Who's going to be the builder of the boat? Where will the workforce come from? What role will Mitsubishi...
I feel like I've heard this song before.
Before, yes.
Yeah.
And so, one possible outcome, and actually I think this is where our government is secretly heading without wanting to say so publicly, is that they will get all of these boats built in Japan. And I should say that the Megami is in service in the Japanese Navy right now, so it's a proven design. This is not a new thing that we're having to reinvent. One of the big requirements is we're not allowed to fiddle around with it to say, well, it needs to have a different combat system or it must operate 2 helicopters rather than 1. It is what it's going to be, which is as close to an off-the-shelf build as we can. Again, Navy's not in love with that reality, but it'll bring us ships sooner.
So we are all for developing a domestic defence industry and defence capability and sovereign capabilities, but simply demanding that something that could be purchased off the shelf needs to be built here is not necessarily advancing that, because for an equivalent cost, and as economists at the IPA, we think of the opportunity cost. Wasn't it like at some stage the building stuff in South Australia, it would have been cheaper just to actually pay people $100,000 a year for the rest of their life.
Yes.
It actually would have been cheaper than the amount of money that the government was trying to put into creating jobs in Adelaide.
So I think the problem we're at is that we've kind of got these legacy plans which are now 20 years and more old about how we were going to build a shipbuilding industry in Australia. The Megami might be one of the last crewed ships we operate as a Navy before we go to autonomous systems altogether. And there's good reason for that, because surface ships are very simple targets, frankly. I mean, you wouldn't really want to be on a surface ship in the South China Sea when the moment comes that we're in a serious conflict. So is this the right form of investment? We need to be able to maintain these ships and keep them going. So that takes probably about as much industrial capability as we've actually got in Henderson in the West to be able to do that. But then, look at... and
that'll be the same with the submarines.
Well, yes, exactly. So Ghost Shark is being 3D printed, Scott. Just get your mind around that. 3D printed in facilities in Sydney that were never part of the traditional defence industry base. That's the future.
That's the opportunity that we have. Yeah. So if you're going to do non-market interventions using taxpayer funds, put it into things like that.
Yes.
Rather than just retrofitting. Yes. It's like the New Zealand car industry back in the old days used to consist of taking cars, getting Australian car manufacturers to disassemble the cars that they'd already built, put them into crates, move them to New Zealand where they would be reassembled, feel it's a bit like
It's
that.
a bit like that. Well, some of the so-called missile production in Australia is very much like that. It's almost literally screwing two halves of the missile together. But, I think that, again, our government is not so quick to think through the reality of this, because they just say, well, we've got to deliver on, what we said we were going to do. Also, and here's something to think about, there's a strong union element involved in ship construction, which is not present in things like small and medium-sized enterprises doing work at the bleeding edge of technology. Where does our government want to put the balance of its investment? So I just think that, we need to sort of be not going back to a clean sheet of paper, but we need to be thinking through some of the fundamentals in light of the big and rapid changes to military technology, which we've seen in Ukraine and the Middle East, and maybe not tie everything into an old metal bashing industry, which is going to produce 9 ships at most, and then what do we do after that?
Yep, which might last 24 hours in a kinetic conflict. Food for thought. Perhaps you can. We'll create room in the next edition of No Higher Priority for a slightly more discursive Peter Jennings essay. Always welcome to do an extended introduction before we get to the business of confirming the need to lift defence expenditure way beyond our initial 3% floor and towards that 5% benchmark, which is increasingly the benchmark for serious countries. Peter, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure and a fascinating discussion. Thank you for being an adjunct fellow of the IPA and helping us put the spotlight on our defence and national security needs.
It's a pleasure to talk with you, Scott. Thanks for having me.